Tongue diagnosis has been used all over the world as a way to assess health and to aid in the selection of herbs and other natural treatments. Now, there are many different traditions of tongue diagnosis coming from the East and the West, but they all share this same idea that the tongue is a microcosm of the whole body. Now, obviously, modern medicine rejects this notion and rarely considers the tongue in any diagnosis that a person gets. However, you do have diseases recognized in modern Western medicine, diseases of the tongue. And at some point, I would like to cover those. But right now, I want to talk about the holistic approach to tongue diagnosis as laid out by the herbalist Matthew Wood. What Matthew Wood has done is to integrate the methods of Chinese tongue diagnosis with insights from the early American eclectic physicians. So this is more geared towards Western herbalism, which is the perspective that I have as an herbalist. All of the material outlined in this video is covered in Matthew Wood's book, The Earthwise Herbal Repertory. So I strongly recommend that you have this book if you're going to study the subject any further. What I'm going to do now is to just briefly cover the different categories of the tongues as outlined in that book. I'm going to name the tongues in those categories, and I'm going to mention some of the herbs to think of with those types of tongues. But I don't mean to suggest that it's that simple. You first have to figure out what the tongue is showing you, and then you figure out what herbs to use. So what I'm saying is before you take the herbs, you want to study those herbs and make sure that they make sense for you. So if you are coming to my current classes, you can submit a picture of your tongue, which we could all use to try to analyze your tongue and try to figure out what might be helpful for you. And if you're not taking the class, I still recommend that you watch this video and look in the mirror and try to figure out which description best describes your tongue. And then you can check Matthew Wood's repertory to see all of the different herbs in that categories and what makes sense to you. But remember, before taking any of the herbs, you want to study those herbs and especially study the safety information that is in regards to those. Before I start showing a bunch of images of tongues, there is one thing I want to say about this, and that is that for beginners, it is sometimes hard to look at tongues, especially unhealthy tongues. And so if you're curious about this subject, but you're maybe a little bit squeamish about that, what I suggest is that you just listen to the audio of this at first and try to learn the different categories, the different colors, the different names for the coatings, and get a sort of sense of that. And then later, when you want to really dive into it, you can start really looking at a massive number of tongues, and it'll actually become very, very interesting. So let's first look at the tongue color. And I'm not talking about the color of the coating on the tongue. I'm talking about the body of the tongue itself. What color is that? So first, there's the carmine red tongue, meaning the bright red tongue. This is most significant if it is long and pointed. This would be the Gene Simmons tongue. This indicates the excited tissue state. There's too much excitement in the tissues themselves, too much heat or too much inflammation. The person needs something cooling and sedating. And I think of the herbs rose, such as rosebuds or rose petals, rose hips, or linden. Those might be something to think of. That's the bright red tongue, but there's also the dark red tongue. This also indicates heat and inflammation, but there's another quality here. The heat is deeper, and there's a depressed state about it. Here we think of, or I would think of the herb dandelion root, but there are many, many others to choose from. Next, there's the pale tongue. That's when there's not enough color on the tongue. A lack of blood is moving through the tongue. This could mean a lack of energy or stimulation or a state of coldness. It could also mean that there's simply a lack of blood, such as an anemic state. Either of those should be considered. Let's now look at the bluish tongue. The tongue could have a bluish color to it, and that's usually not over the entire tongue, but just in different sections of the tongue. And that indicates stagnation of blood, like when you see a bruise. If it's the center of the tongue that's blue, and then there's red on the sides, that really points to the herb yarrow, which should be studied. If you lift up the tongue and you see some enlarged veins underneath, that would point towards the herb angelica. The more unusual colors you could see on the tongue are purple, brown, or black. These are considered more serious, sometimes indicating dangerous septic conditions, and I think of herbs like echinacea and baptisia or wild indigo. The blackish tongue is something that I've only seen a couple of times, and it was only when it was pretty obvious that a person was nearing the end of life. Okay, so let's talk about the protuberances on the tongue, or the papilla, the little red bumps that you'll sometimes see. This is used to indicate immune stimulation or perhaps a chronic infection. It may indicate lymphatic stagnation, and I think of the herb calendula here. So that's what we've looked at of the tongue body itself. And now I want to look at the coating on the tongue. There's normally a thin white coat on the tongue, very, very subtle, very thin, whitish coat. That's normal, that's healthy. And sometimes the tongue doesn't have that and it's completely dry. If you see a dry tongue, that indicates a state of dryness in the body. And it could also mean atrophy of the tissues. And this generally calls for tonics to build up the fluids in the body, such as the herb marshmallow. Sometimes the tongue is really wet and can be dripping or have foamy bubbles. That's the moist tongue, sometimes called the relaxed tongue. It indicates a need for astringents, such as crane's bill or raspberry leaf. If there's a white coating on the tongue, and I don't mean just that subtle, thin, whitish coat, but if it's a thicker white coat, that would also indicate the relaxed tongue, where there's dampness, but in this case, the dampness is starting to congeal into phlegm. The herbs you may think of here could be the same as in the other category, but you might need something more stimulating added in, such as ginger. The ginger might help. Now let's talk about the greasy yellow-coated tongue. That's when there's a yellow sticky coating, indicating what I'd call a toxic phlegm condition or an unhealthy type of fluid building up in the body. This indicates the need for that class of herbs known as alteratives, which is a whole separate subject I could get into. You need something to detoxify and cleanse out those fluids, and there are many to choose from. You might think of golden seal in this case. A more extreme version of this would be the brown-coated tongue. This indicates a septic toxic fluid buildup, and here I'd think of the herbs baptisia and also Oregon grape root. So that's the coatings on the tongue. And then there's another type of coating I want to talk about, which is the mapped tongue, also known as the geographic tongue. That's where there's a coating, but it's all broken up into these different patches. And that suggests a type of deep heat or inflammation that is transforming the fluids of the body. The go-to herb for myself and many other herbalists is dandelion root. That usually is really helpful when you see that geographic or mapped tongue. So the final thing I'd like to talk about is the regions of the tongue. And this comes from Chinese medicine, although there are aspects of this in traditional Western herbalism as well. It's a way of looking at the different parts of the tongue as representing different regions or sections of the body. It's kind of like reflexology for the tongue. So I have this map pictured here, and this is one created by the herbalist Matthew Wood again, and he's drawing upon Chinese herbal medicine, but he's also adding in a few modern anatomical things as well, such as you'll see the thyroid gland at the very tip. So the map can be a little bit complicated and confusing at first, but basically it's just an upside down torso overlaid over the tongue. So you've got the heart and lungs and breasts closer to the tip of the tongue. Then in the middle, which would be in the region of your solar plexus, you'll see the stomach, spleen, and liver. And then if you go further down the tongue and further down your torso, you'd come to the kidneys. Then at the very root of the tongue, you'd be getting into the organs of the pelvis. So when you look at the tongue, you look for regional differences. Like if it's more damp in the back of the tongue, the kidney area, or more red at the tip of the tongue, the heart area. And you also look for markings on the tongue, like little fissures or erosions on the tongue. That could suggest a particular organ needs some repair or some support. So that's tongue diagnosis in a nutshell. I hope that wasn't too confusing. It's a deep, rich subject and one well worth studying in depth. Many herbalists use tongue diagnosis as the central theme of their prescriptions. So rather than choosing herbs based upon symptoms or a medical diagnosis, you just look at the tongue and choose herbs based on that. And I see that as a very effective way to go. So I encourage you to study this subject more from Chinese herbalism and from other sources as well. And it will help you out if you're looking to find herbs for yourself and for others as well. So thanks for watching.